Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirk, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 7 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're going to be talking about all things related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses are giving up the most points thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format in order to determine who has the most advantageous or perhaps most disadvantageous matchup going into the week and how that will potentially affect a wide receiver's overall upside. After we talk about the matchups going into Week 7, we'll talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings. For those of you who are looking for a specific player, of course, you can go down to the description of the video and find timestamps. Of course, while you're down there, if you have not yet already and you're new to the channel, subscribe. We are on our way to 55,000 subscribers. And of course, we're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2021 season. So if you're interested in content such as rankings, rest of season strength of schedule, hidden gems, trade targets, must start players of the week, live streams every Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, trying to help you set your lineup, all of that in order to help you win a 2021 fantasy football championship. So if you're interested, subscribe. Also, besides that, of course, check out Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who are trying to play fantasy football or fantasy sports in general outside of your respective leagues and just trying to have more fun, you can go ahead, travel there today, go down to the description, click on the link, and use promo code Andrew. With your first deposit of $10 or more, you'll be given an additional $10 in bonus cash that you can use on whether or not it's Thursday night's, of course, contest between the Cleveland Browns and Denver Broncos, or the weekly pick'ems, the Sunday battle royales for the fantasy football season, or other sports. Doesn't matter. It's all fun. For those of you who are interested, check that out and use promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. Now that we've covered all that, we'll go ahead and move on and begin by talking about matchups for Week 7 at the wide receiver position. As you can see to the left of me, we have the fantasy points per game on average that defenses have given up to respective opposing wide receivers thus far this season. Of course, some of these teams have played 6 games while others have played 5 games. I've obviously taken that into account in terms of determining the average. Do not worry. I do this every week. But in terms of points given up to respective wide receivers, the Tennessee Titans have been awful, and that's great for wide receivers like McCole Hardman, of course, Tyreek Hill, maybe Demarcus Robinson, Byron Pringle, maybe Josh Gordon wants to show up, but of course, singularly, it's going to help Tyreek Hill in his entirety. Now, other receivers that are obviously going to benefit from matchups this upcoming week based on the fact of the Washington football team, the Miami Dolphins, Pittsburgh Steelers, Cleveland Browns. These are defenses that are giving up a bunch of points. Obviously, we know that there are 6 teams on bye this week. So as I mentioned, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Cowboys, the Bills, the Chargers, the Jacksonville Jaguars, and the Minnesota Vikings are all on bye this week. So they respectively will not be, taken advantage of this week if in fact their secondaries haven't been playing well. But some of these other defenses, like let's say for example, the Washington football team, unfortunately have to take on Davante Adams. Interestingly enough, our typical top 2 wide receivers on a weekly basis have the easiest matchups going into this week, which is fantastic for them. Calvin Ridley coming off a personal issue and a bye week will of course take on the Miami Dolphins. That's great for him. The Cleveland Browns secondary looked horrible against the Arizona Cardinals, and to be honest, against number 1 wide receivers have struggled mightily. Courtland Sutton's coming into town after being, a top 12 wide receiver for the last 4 or 5 weeks. I mean, he's going to obviously have himself another big week here. We're going to have a lot of potential upside here for a lot of these wide receivers based on matchups. So we'll go ahead and we'll take this into account. I will refer back to it as we progress throughout the video. A couple of the statistics that we always want to go ahead and look at is how many touchdowns have some of these respective defenses given up. The Indianapolis Colts, though they haven't given up as many receptions or receiving yards, my goodness, they are getting torched down in the red zone by opposing wide receivers. That has been a thing that has been plaguing them the entirety of the season, and there's a reason why number 1 wide receivers against that defense have dominated and why Deebo Samuel may have a huge week here on hand with G coming back at the quarterback position. Either way, now that we've covered that, hopefully you can go ahead, pause this, check it out for yourself, kind of determine the strength of schedule going forward. If you guys haven't checked out my strength of schedule video for the rest of the 2021 season, I did the calculations and posted that last Friday. I'll throw it up right here for those of you to go check that out. Of course, a lot of great information for those of you who are looking to trade for specific players that, of course, will have really advantageous matchups going forward and in the fantasy football playoffs if in fact you're trying to prepare for something of that extent, considering maybe you're already 5-1, 6-0, and you're just trying to get ahead of everyone in your respective league. Okay, now that we've talked about matchups, let's go ahead and let's talk about our top 36 wide receiver rankings. Do not forget, this is for half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle. Of course, rankings are always subject to change. There is so much going around in the NFL, and in the wide receiver position alone, we are missing Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, Marvin Jones Jr., Laviska Shenault, Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen. Who am I missing? There's another team here that's on a bye week. Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, Emmanuel Sanders. There are so many wide receivers that are out this week. This may be, in my opinion, the thinnest wide receiver rankings I've ever done on this channel. There really hasn't been this much of a lack of talent that I've seen in quite some time, besides the injuries that have already taken place, the inconsistencies of some players, and the fact that we have 6 vital teams that are on their bye weeks that, of course, all respectively have at least 2 minimum contributing wide receivers that are typically at least one mentioned in this top 36 every single week, if not both or 3 of them. Regardless, rankings are subject to change. Keep that in mind as we progress through this video. Again, timestamps down in the description. All right, let's go ahead and begin today's video by talking about the wide receiver ones, the top 12, how I think it's going to potentially stack up going into this week. We'll begin with Davante Adams of the Green Bay Packers. Okay, now Davante Adams, of course, is one of the better wide receivers in the National Football League. Obviously has the second easiest matchup of the week playing against the Washington football team, a secondary that in the last couple weeks has given up Tyreek Hill 7 catches, 96 yards, and a touchdown. Emmanuel Sanders had himself 2 receiving touchdowns and 94 receiving yards on 5 catches. And Marquez Callaway was even able to come out of that game with 4 catches, 85 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns, while Deontay Harris, the wide receiver on the other side of the field, had himself a 72-yard reception for a touchdown. The Washington football team secondary has been terrible all season long. And in my opinion, though Davante Adams is coming off of another one of these mediocre performances of only 4 catches for 89 yards, I truly do think he's going to have himself another breakout game here and kind of get us back on track for, of course, another big performance. I think he's a great play going into this week, and that is why he remains as our number 1. We move on to our number 2 wide receiver for this respective week. We have ourselves Tyreek Hill. Now, here's the thing about Tyreek Hill. Of course, he has himself the volatility like all wide receivers respectively have, but as of late has continued to string together some good performances here. Has been dealing with a knee injury last week, but was able to play through it and ultimately had a great performance of 18.1 total fantasy points, 9 receptions, 67 yards, and a touchdown. Like I mentioned, he played against the Washington football team this last week, a great matchup, and this upcoming week gets the easiest matchup at the wide receiver position, taking on the Tennessee Titans defense, and a defense that, as we saw on Monday night, is heavily dealing with injuries, especially in the secondary. And I don't even know how Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley having great games weren't able to win the game on that final drive with, of course, passing the ball, considering how many, secondary injuries they had sustained. Nonetheless, Tyreek Hill is going to be able to take advantage of it. It hasn't just been, of course, Stephon Diggs that's coming off a great week against this Tennessee Titans defense in which he scored a touchdown, had 89 receiving yards. Corey Davis, 4 catches, 111 and a touchdown. We had, of course, Tyler Lockett, 8 catches, 178 and a touchdown. DeAndre Hopkins, the first game of the season, along with, of course, Christian Kirk, both had 2 receiving touchdowns in that respective game. There's a reason why Tennessee's given up the most touchdowns to opposing wide receivers. It's because they really can't stop anything in the secondary. A lot of inexperience, a lot of injuries. DeAndre Hopkins and our thumbnail is our number 3 for this week, mainly because of the revenge game. Of course, DeAndre Hopkins would want to play up against Bill O'Brien in every single scenario here, but he'll go ahead and he'll take the advantage of playing against his former team, getting a little bit of revenge here because, of course, unceremoniously was traded away for David Johnson of all running backs. And, it is what it is. DeAndre Hopkins has a mission, and he's probably going to achieve that mission this week as he completely decimates that entire defense for the Houston Texans. And though their secondary has played relatively well, it's mainly because respective offenses haven't, had to pass the ball against them. All you got to do is play decent defense and run the rock. And that's exactly what Indianapolis did this last week. Despite that, of course, we saw some work out of, T.Y. Hilton, 4 catches, 80 yards. Paris Campbell got himself 1 catch, 51 yards and a touchdown. I truly do believe that DeAndre Hopkins is on a pace in which, of course, he's going to dominate against his defense. And a reason why DeAndre Hopkins is in this conversation, besides the fact that he plays against his former team and the revenge game is probably going to be beneficial, is that he already has as many touchdowns right now this season within 6 weeks than he did all of last season for the Arizona Cardinals. He has 6 touchdowns already. If he continues with this pace, of course, he's going to continue to be a higher upside player than he normally is, isn't having to rely upon the receptions to get him his baseline. Because, again, this last week only had 3 catches for 55 yards, but the 2 touchdowns certainly did save him, and that's going to continue to save him throughout the season. We move on to Cooper Kupp as our number 4. What more could we ask for? This guy is unstoppable. 10 plus targets every single week thus far this season for Cooper Kupp. On top of that, already has 7 touchdowns. I mean, his season high is 10, and that was in 2019. And then this last week had 29.5 fantasy points. That's the 4th time this season that he has surpassed 20 plus fantasy points for a performance in the first 6 weeks. I mean, Cooper Kupp is unstoppable. And then he gets the privilege of taking on the Detroit Lions secondary. Yes, they aren't giving up that many points to opposing wide receivers, but it only takes 1 week in order to get a defense that is just, on that brink of being terrible to just getting exposed completely. Of course, they've been exposed already this season. Deebo Samuel, week 1, 9 catches, 189 and a touchdown. Of course, we had Davante Adams, 8 catches for 121. Jamar Chase's last week, 4 catches for 97. I think Cooper Kupp, if there's ever been a time in which, of course, he's going to dominate, it's because Matthew Stafford is taking on his former team. Another one of these revenge games, and Kupp's going to be up for the task to be, of course, balling out and scoring a lot of points for his respective quarterback. We're moving on to Deebo Samuel on number 5. Speaking of Deebo Samuel, of course, he had himself a couple good performances this year already, but this upcoming week, he takes on the Indianapolis Colts, giving up the 9th most points to opposing wide receivers. Deebo Samuel's coming off a bye week. This is a bye week that they relatively needed in order to figure out the quarterback position and kind of get them healthy, because overall they haven't been. But here's the thing that a lot of people are kind of looking over in terms of Deebo Samuel, his potential, and what he's already done this season. He's currently number 3 amongst all wide receivers in a half PPR in fantasy point per game average scored. It's 18.9 fantasy points per game. He is at the top tier of the wide receiver position. And the fact that he gets an incredible matchup like this is going to be fantastic for him. Now, yes, Brandon Ayuk could come out of nowhere and help, but with George Kittle out, the running game not really being that effective, with Jimmy Garoppolo probably returning as a starting quarterback, and the fact that Deebo Samuel has gotten 8 plus targets at every single game this season, I think that he's in line for a great performance here. Of course, we've seen Lockett and Metcalf combined for 8 catches, 160 and 3 touchdowns against his defense. Kupp, 9 catches, 163 and 2 touchdowns. Devontae Parker went for 4 catches, 77 and a touchdown. Marquise Brown, 9 catches, 125 and 2 touchdowns. Even Brandin Cooks with Davis Mills is going for 9 catches and 89 yards. Can anybody get stopped in the secondary? No. And there's a reason why also Indianapolis has given up as many touchdowns as the Tennessee Titans, because the wide receiver position dominates, and Deebo Samuel is going to be a guy to have great upside this week. Calvin Ridley as our number 6 for this week, playing against the Miami Dolphins secondary. With Marvin Jones Jr. coming off of a performance in London, 7 catches, 100 yards and a touchdown. The week prior, of course, Tom Brady threw for 400 yards and 5 passing touchdowns. AB and Mike Evans were easily able to dominate against that secondary. I think Calvin Ridley's in line for a fantastic week. And the reason why I think so is because in the last 3 games that we've seen Calvin Ridley produce, I mean, he's gotten opportunity and he's been able to succeed. In the last 3 games, 10 targets, 11 targets, 13 targets. That has led to 7, 8, and 7 receptions, at least a minimum of 60 receiving yards in every single one of those games. And yes, he's only been able to score 1 touchdown in the last 3 contests that he's participated in. But ultimately, when I look at Calvin Ridley and his potential upside against the secondary that has struggled heavily because of the fact that Xavier Howard has been dealing with an injury and they haven't been able to stop anybody, whether it's on the ground or through the air, they need to go ahead and continue to stack the box, which leaves their secondary out to dry. In my opinion, Calvin Ridley is in a very advantageous position. Moving on to our number 7, we have DJ Moore of the Carolina Panthers. And I know what you may be thinking, Sam Darnold is not playing well, and I understand that. But regardless of Sam Darnold's potential struggles and the fact that he's continuing to regress every week thus far now, he plays against one of the easier matchups, the wide receiver position. The New York Giants are giving up the 11th most points to opposing wide receivers. There's a reason why, Cooper Kupp, like we mentioned earlier on today's episode, went for 29.5 fantasy points. Robert Woods was able to score a touchdown. The week prior, CeeDee Lamb and Amari Cooper were both able to score. Terry McLaurin earlier this season had himself 11 catches, 107 yards, and a touchdown on that Thursday night game. This secondary has been struggling all season long. And the promising factor here is that DJ Moore is at least still getting his targets. 13 targets this last week, and though he was only able to catch 5 of them for 73 yards, I truly do think that it's eventually going to get back on track, and we're going to find DJ Moore continuing to succeed in this offense. And without Christian McCaffrey back there, again, Hubbard isn't going to get as many targets. Of course, we've seen a lot of targets be distributed in the direction of Robby Anderson, and he hasn't been able to do much with it. But again, it has been the struggles of Sam Darnold that has held back this receiving core as of the last 3 weeks, and hopefully isn't going to continue as DJ Moore has himself a great matchup this week against the New York Giants. I got a lot of hope and potential upside going in his direction here. Moving on to Antonio Brown on number 8. I thought about it for a while, and Antonio Brown in the last 3 weeks has had 32 total targets. I mean, that is an unbelievable number. In the last 3 weeks, in terms of total fantasy points, he's the number 2 overall wide receiver in half PPR. Takes on the Chicago Bears, and really the matchup doesn't bother me because when I went and I watched film this last week, I mean, Antonio Brown is a third down receiver. When you need a first down, you need to move the chains. Tom Brady's going in one direction, and it is going to Antonio Brown. It is pretty much his safety blanket. There are so many designed plays in this offense, whether it be screens or just the first read being Antonio Brown, that is just sending the ball in his direction on such a consistent basis that, of course, he's able to score as consistently as he had in the last couple of weeks. Now, on top of that, last week's performance against the Philadelphia Eagles, his touchdown was a little bit of a broken play. Tom Brady was able to scramble for a little bit. He found the seam in that defense. Of course, they were playing a lot of cover two, and was able to split that. Obviously, a little bit of a cover two beater, unintentionally, but nonetheless, was able to score himself a touchdown for the second consecutive week. As long as he's getting these amount of targets in the double-digit range every single week, we can't really do anything else but play him. And that's just going to be the case because I have no problem playing him in any sort of capacity. In fact, I love that there's another receiver in fantasy football that we didn't anticipate to be this good, breaking out and having a great performance. I don't even care that he plays against Chicago. They've had themselves a couple performances here and there that they've struggled mightily against. Going back to week 1, Cooper Kupp, that's standing above him. As soon as I see it on screen, I think to myself, yeah, they can give up points in bunches. But either way, Antonio Brown, a great play this week as our number 8. Number 9 is A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown had a little bit of a sick game / injured game on Monday night. Still, returning from that hamstring injury, he was still able to come out 7 catches on 9 targets for 91 yards and 12.6 fantasy points. But that wasn't the only thing that was ailing him. He was still dealing with, of course, a little bit of a sickness that he had gotten on Saturday. They said it was a stomach flu of some sort. My goodness, the fact that he was able to, you could even tell when you looked at his face when the camera was on him, he didn't look well, but he was able to come out against one of the best secondaries, against one of the most difficult matchups at the wide receiver position this season, the Buffalo Bills, and put up a great performance when they needed him most, especially in the second half, converting vital third and longs in order to get this team in the right position and help Derrick Henry finish the game off. Ultimately, A.J. Brown's going to continue to progress, and I think this is only just the beginning of his breakout for the rest of this season. Once he gets to a full healthy capacity, whether it is with his quad or with his stomach flu that he was dealing with, he's going to be taking over. And why not do that this week against the Kansas City Chiefs, as they've given up a lot of points to opposing wide receivers, on top of the fact that Julio Jones is probably hurt again. He re-injured himself. Eventually, they're going to have to throw the ball heavily. Without Jonnu Smith there, without a Julio Jones, there really isn't any, without Corey Davis, it is really just A.J. Brown as the sole receiving option in this offense. And I like their potential this week as, of course, if they have to potentially keep up with Kansas City, A.J. Brown will help them do so. But otherwise, it is a Derrick Henry-led offense. We move on to Marquise Hollywood Brown as our number 10. I have so much confidence in Hollywood Brown, not only because Cincinnati has shown that they, of course, can give up points in bunches to opposing wide receivers, but because Hollywood Brown, though he's coming off a very, underwhelming week against the Los Angeles Chargers, it was anticipated as, the Chargers have one of the toughest, secondaries in order to score against in fantasy football. But in the last 3 games that Marquise Brown in 2020 and in 2019 has played against the Cincinnati Bengals, he has always played well. This is one of their, favorite matchups. In fact, Lamar Jackson hasn't averaged more fantasy points against any other team in his career than the Cincinnati Bengals. He dominated against that defense as a whole. In the last 3 contests that Marquise Brown has played against them, going back to 2019, 4 catches, 80 yards, and a touchdown. The beginning of 2018, 6 catches, 77 yards, and a touchdown. And at the end of 2020, had himself 5 catches, 41 yards, 2 touchdowns. He is going to continue his touchdown reign that has already pretty much existed this year. Of course, not this last week, but he's going to continue it against the Cincinnati Bengals this week. He is a fantastic option and for sure our number 10. Moving on to our number 11, we have Terry McLaurin of the Washington football team taking on the Green Bay Packers. With Jair Alexander, going into the injured reserve, the number 1 cornerback and one of the best cornerbacks in the National Football League for the Green Bay Packers, it of course has exposed the idea that of course you can heavily throw the ball against the Green Bay Packers and find success. In the last couple weeks, Deontay Johnson, 19.7 fantasy points. Jamar Chase, 24.9 fantasy points. Darnell Mooney was able to get himself 13 fantasy points. And even, Allen Robinson looked like he was having the best game of his season thus far, even though he was only able to get like 7.4 fantasy points. Terry McLaurin, going into this upcoming week, again, his opportunity is beginning to drop to the point where, again, if he's only going to be catching the ball 4 or 5 times a week, he needs a touchdown. And that kind of touchdown dependency is not something that I'm interested in. But going into this matchup, I think there's been enough potential showings from other number 1 wide receivers that gives me enough confidence in Taylor Heinicke and in Terry McLaurin that they can get the job done this week and be able to eventually, get him in the end zone, or at least pepper him with enough targets and funnel target him enough to get him going. Without Antonio Gibson in the lineup, running the ball may not be an option. And of course, if they're going to have to air it out and Ricky Seals-Jones is questionable and Curtis Samuel may not be returning, Terry McLaurin has a lot of upside this week. Ja'Marr Chase. Speaking of Ja'Marr Chase, in the last couple weeks that he's had, of course, he came off a 24.9 point fantasy point performance against the Green Bay Packers into the Detroit Lions matchup, in which he was only able to get himself 4 catches for 97 yards. But nonetheless, a great performance. Obviously, the running back position for the Cincinnati Bengals were able to get the 2 receiving touchdowns from Joe Burrow. But now that I look at this upcoming week's matchup, and I think, okay, the potential of Ja'Marr Chase is relatively high, but he gets his toughest test on hand this week against Marlon Humphreys, the number 1 cornerback of the Baltimore Ravens. I talked about it last week in relation to Mike Williams. I was worried about Mike Williams not only because of the knee issue that he was dealing with, but because Marlon Humphreys is a lockdown corner. And Ja'Marr Chase, this is your first test. Welcome to the NFL. Of course, you've had him yourself a solid 6 weeks, but this is going to be the question. If you can dominate Marlon Humphreys, then nobody should ever give you a problem, and you should be in the top 12 category rest of season. But if in fact you get shut down, that's going to be the biggest question mark. But regardless, I'm firing him up. I think he's got what it takes. And as long as Joe Burrow continues to target him as much as he has in the last couple of weeks, and of course get those receptions for as many yards as he's gotten, the touchdowns will eventually get there. I think Ja'Marr Chase, a great option to close out our wide receiver 1 conversation. Moving on to our wide receiver 2 category, we begin with Courtland Sutton playing on Thursday night against the Cleveland Browns. They're giving up the 5th most points to opposing wide receivers this season, and that wasn't always the case. In fact, last week this time, they were giving up the 21st most points to opposing wide receivers. You may be wondering, Andrew, what kind of a drastic shift did we have? Well, besides the fact that the Cleveland Browns gave up, 19 points to DeAndre Hopkins, 16.4 fantasy points to AJ Green, and 16 fantasy points to Christian Kirk. That hasn't just been the only time that they've given up fantasy points to wide receivers, and it finally has caught up to them that the secondary, similar to last year, cannot stop wide receivers. And the amount of injuries that they are facing this week, whether it is on the offense or on the defense itself, I mean, it is going to make a huge difference and potentially lead to even more success for Denver this week. We've seen other wide receiver ones like Tyreek Hill, 11 catches, 197 and a touchdown. Brandin Cooks, 9 catches, 78 and a touchdown. Justin Jefferson, 6 catches, 84 and a touchdown. Mike Williams, 8 catches, 165 and 2 touchdowns. Courtland Sutton is no different. He's coming off of a week in which he had 14 targets, 8 receptions, 94 yards, 1 touchdown, 19.4 fantasy points. Cleveland just looked hopeless last week in terms of stopping opposing wide receivers, and I think Courtland Sutton is on track to have himself another great week. Since week 2, in terms of total fantasy points scored, he is number 11 at the wide receiver position, and I think he's going to continue to ball out as a number 13 this week. Number 14 is Mike Evans. Though Mike Evans didn't have a great performance, once we streamed after the Thursday night game, I went ahead and I was, being asked, Andrew, why did Mike Evans not show up in this game? Well, I went and watched the film, and easily you could find that when they went down to the red zone, he was given an opportunity to score a touchdown. But what happens? Darius Slay jumps on his back, defensive pass interference. The touchdown is pretty much, thrown over his head. And of course, then you got Leonard Fournette punching it in the next play. If that's going to continue to happen, of course, Mike Evans is going to be given the opportunity. But the fact that the opportunity is at least there and the targets are going in his direction, regardless of the outcome, that's all we need. Truly, that is all we need. Only 2 receptions for 27 yards is a little bit of a tough, pill to swallow for last week. But nonetheless, he plays against Chicago. I'm not worried about the matchup. The last time he played him last year, 9 total targets, 4 receptions, 51 yards, and a touchdown. Of course, he was the only healthy wide receiver on that offense outside of Scotty Miller with Tom Brady, and that's why he was able to score with so many weapons in this respective offense, with, of course, the tight end position being targeted 11 times last week, the running back position being targeted 9 times this last week. There's always going to be those weeks in which Mike Evans disappears. I'm not worried about it. I think with however much upside he continues to present every single week, he's a must-play as our number 14. Moving on to Robert Woods, our number 15. I love Robert Woods. Obviously, come off, a pretty I would say in comparison to that Seattle Seahawks game, it's underwhelming to say the least. 2 receptions, 31 yards, and a touchdown. Last week against the New York Giants, Now he takes on the Detroit Lions. Hopefully, Matthew Stafford's going for 5, 6, 7 touchdowns. Maybe he wants to break the record this week, and hopefully that's going to be the case, and that's the entire game plan, because truly, number one wide receivers have dominated against this defense. Whether it be Deebo Samuel for 189 and a touchdown, Adams for 121 total yards, Justin Jefferson 124 total yards, Jamar Chase 97 total yards, Darnell Mooney had himself 5 catches for 125. Everyone has dominated against this defense, and I truly do think that Robert Woods isn't any different. Sure, he may not be as skilled, may not be getting as many targets as some of these other guys, but I think this is going to be a statement game for Matthew Stafford, and Robert Woods is definitely going to benefit from it. Chris Godwin is our number 16. In the same conversation that I just had with Antonio Brown and Mike Evans, let's understand that Chris Godwin, there's a lot of designed plays for him, whether it's screen passes, whether it's plays in which, of course, they're purposely getting him open on pick routes. The whole concept of this offense is, of course, spread the wealth. They're never going to go to a wide receiver consecutively back-to-back on singular plays. They're really spreading it out, whether it's going to Howard, then to Fournette the next play, then to Antonio Brown, Mike Evans. They're spreading the wealth. And unless Chris Godwin is going to score a touchdown, 5 targets, 5 receptions, and 43 yards is not going to cut it. Now, with that all said, when I was watching film here, it was easy to see that Chris Godwin had many opportunities to score a touchdown. In fact, Tom Brady drops back into the pocket and literally on the seam, breaking the cover 2, Godwin's wide open. If he slings the ball in between it just in the nick of time, he scores a touchdown there. But unfortunately, Tom Brady drops back, looks at his first read, throws it to Antonio Brown, 10 yards out of bounds, no problem. There are always opportunities for these receivers to score. But though you may be upset, they're hidden. You just got to go and pretty much dissect it and find where they were, given the opportunities and where it was taken away. Understand that the Philadelphia game was heavily a game in which they were running the ball and killing clock because they were up, 28-7 at one point, and then the 2 touchdowns came in late. So that's why the wide receiver position with Evans and Godwin weren't as, involved as in weeks prior. Either way, going into this week against Chicago, I have a lot of confidence. They always will have major upside, and that's why they remain top 16 wide receivers as a group. We move on to DK Metcalf as number 17. Speaking of upside, look, it only takes one catch from DK Metcalf, regardless of who's throwing the ball. Whether it's even Russell Wilson throwing with his left hand, I don't even care. It really just takes one play, and DK Metcalf's going to score. And that in itself gives me some excitement at the potential of what he could do. Yes, he's coming off a week in which he had 6 catches, 58 yards, and 8.8 fantasy points. The question remains, what could we potentially see this week against New Orleans? New Orleans has given up points. I know that, Marshawn Lattimore can be a good cornerback at times, but, Golladay 116 in terms of total yards against them. Kendrick Bourne 96 and a touchdown. Myers 9 catch, 94 yards. And we had DJ Moore 8 catches, 79 and a touchdown. The secondary has struggled mightily against number 1 wide receivers and outside wide receivers at that. If we can get DK Metcalf in a position in which he's at least getting red zone targets or at least end zone targets deep down the field, though Geno Smith didn't really look for those kind of plays this last week against Pittsburgh, hopefully we'll kind of review that in practice and start sending the ball deep in the direction of DK Metcalf, because I think the upside is definitely there. We move on to Jaylen Waddle at number 18. He is literally his number 1 guy. Going from college and playing together and then now into the NFL, and the fact that they take on the 8th easiest matchup of the week against the Atlanta Falcons. Jaylen Waddle had 13 targets, 10 receptions, 70 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. The last time they played together was week 1. And guess what? Jaylen Waddle had a touchdown in that week as well. So if in fact we're in a situation in which Parker, Fuller, Preston Williams, they're still dealing with injuries, and of course the fact that Tua likes to check down the ball consistently every single week, Jaylen Waddle has incredible upside in a fantastic matchup. As long as opportunity is there and Tua is there, I think Jaylen Waddle is in a great position. And even without Tua in the lineup, with Jakobi Brissett in weeks past, has of course gotten himself double-digit targets and of course found a lot of potential upside. That's why he's our number 18. Moving on to Brandin Cooks, our number 19. Brandin Cooks, regardless of who's at the quarterback position, has been incredible throughout his entire career. Even if we go back to playing with Breeze, then going to Tom Brady, then being traded to the Rams with Jared Goff, and then now with the Houston Texans, regardless of what we've seen, he has always played well. Coming off a week in which he had 13 targets, whenever he's with Davis Mills and they're not playing against New England or Buffalo, he's getting double-digit targets. And that has pretty much been the case all season long. So the fact that they play against the Arizona Cardinals does not bother me. I think Brandin Cooks is in line for another wide receiver 2 week with the opportunity being there. And of course, the fact that the Houston Texans will be trailing for majority of every game that they play this season. Of course, Brandin Cooks is going to be that number 1 guy on the outside getting a lot of exposure of opportunity. Moving on to Sterling Shepard. I think Kadarius Toney's probably going to be out this week dealing with his injury, considering he did not return to the game on Sunday. But let's go ahead and talk about Kadarius Toney. He started that game on the first drive of the Giants series with 3 catches for 36 yards. With that said, Sterling Shepard was on more offensive plays in that first drive than Kadarius Toney when they had even began. So as a whole, Shepard's going to be on the field, and they could possibly coexist in this offense going forward. But nonetheless, Sterling Shepard had himself 14 targets, 10 receptions, 76 yards. Pretty much picked up where he left off prior to his hamstring injury that he sustained against the New Orleans Saints. So going into this upcoming week against the Carolina Panthers, it doesn't bother me. Even if Stephon Gilmore comes back, he's going to be covering, the outside receiver, whether that is Dante Pettis, John Ross, Kenny Golladay, Colin Johnson. And Sterling Shepard's going to be in that slot position, and he is going to be eating, because we've seen it already this season. Daniel Jones just checks it down to his slot, receivers, and they dominate every single week. Moving on to our number 21, we have DeVonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. And though he didn't perform well this last week, it really wasn't on him. It's mainly the quarterback and the entire offensive scheme, because we know that he can produce. I mean, we saw it against Kansas City, 122 total receiving yards, and even against the Carolina Panthers, in which he had 7 catches for 77 yards. But this last week, unfortunately, Jalen Hurts was running for his life. And though this team did literally not, I think they ran the ball with the running back position, Miles Sanders, twice in the first half. And in the second half, obviously got him 7 rushing attempts, but they literally did not run the ball. And DeVonta Smith is not getting more than 4 targets. And why is that the case? Well, mainly because Jalen Hurts is running for his life, because the pass rush was just overwhelming with, Shaq Barrett, JPP on one side, Vita Vea, Ndamukong Suh. They're going to get after him. Even Devin White was just free man blitzing, just sending it into the backfield. And that mainly has to do with the fact that, of course, if your secondary can at least bottle him up for a couple seconds here, you're going to get to the quarterback, and he's always going to roll right because he's a right-hand quarterback. And though it could lead to some broken plays, it doesn't give enough time for DeVonta Smith to at least make a route and get open. Truly, it didn't. So with that all said, I think going into this upcoming week's matchup, there's a lot of potential. And there's a lot of upside. Though the fact that, the Las Vegas Raiders haven't given up many points to opposing wide receivers this season, Courtland Sutton and Tim Patrick both found a lot of success this last week, both scoring touchdowns, mainly because, again, the outside corners of this offense, Trayvon Mullen and Casey Hayward, have both been dealing with injuries. And if you can get a situation in which Max Crosby isn't running down, Jalen Hurts this week, DeVonta Smith will find a lot more success, and hopefully that's going to be the case. But otherwise, he has a lot of potential upside. It's just in those tougher matchups where the pass rush is getting there that he's not going to be able to get the ample amount of opportunity because Jalen Hurts is under far too much pressure. AJ Green's our number 22. AJ Green's basically here because he has been so damn consistent. 4 out of the last 5 weeks of 10-plus fantasy points, coming off of another game in which he had 16.4 fantasy points, a receiving touchdown on 6 targets. And the funny thing is, he has not surpassed 6 targets this season. In fact, in 5 of the 6 games, he has seen a maximum of 6 total targets. We'll take the opportunity because this offense that is associated with, Kyler Murray and the firepower that they have and are probably going to, utilize against this Houston Texans defense. Obviously, we expect, the thumbnail himself, DeAndre Hopkins, to find success. But secondary to that, it is going to be AJ Green, as he has played far beyond our expectations this season. A guy that has been injured his majority of his career has finally found the fountain of youth and has taken advantage of it as he's continuing to put together great fantasy point performances for us. Moving on to our number 23, we have Allen Robinson. All right, here's the issue. Allen Robinson hasn't played well this season, but at least this last week was decent. 7 targets, 4 receptions, 53 yards, 7.3 fantasy points. Am I happy with that? Absolutely not. Is he a wide receiver 3? Absolutely. But why do I have him at the low-end wide receiver 2 conversation? Mainly because they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Like I just talked about with DeVonta Smith a couple minutes back, they may end up blitzing and just sending pressure in the direction of Justin Fields the whole game. They may give him the Jalen Hurts treatment, in which they're trying to get him out of the pocket, rolling to his right, and just, dismembering this offensive line with their pass rush and linebacker pressure. If that's going to be the case, well, of course, you're going to have Allen Robinson catching the ball a lot this week, just getting it out of the hands of Justin Fields. The thing that kind of is promising for this respective matchup is the fact that Tampa Bay has really struggled in the secondary this, season. Besides week 1 against the Cowboys, in the last couple of weeks, we saw, Calvin Ridley 7 catches, 63 yards and a touchdown. Cooper Kupp 9 catches, 96 yards, 2 touchdowns. Wide receivers have played well against them. But it's only a matter of time until what we can, potentially see Allen Robinson turn into last season when they played against this defense. Allen Robinson had 16 targets, 10 receptions, and 90 yards. He's probably nowhere near 16 targets. But if the number increases, because again, that secondary is all injured. And if there's no one going to be out there that could potentially deal with the talent level of an Allen Robinson, then I think he has a lot of upside. And that's why I have him at number 23. Number 24 is Jakobi Meyers. You know what's funny? Jakobi Meyers scored his first receiving touchdown of his career, only to then realize there was a flag 15 yards in the opposite direction, and the play was called back. And what could have been would have been fantastic against the Dallas Cowboys secondary. But unfortunately, Jakobi Meyers was limited to only 8.9 fantasy points, was able to get himself a 2-point conversion, which means at least, we're getting a little bit of a couple looks here and there down in the red zone. Jakobi Meyers has seen a little bit of a target decrease in the last couple weeks, but in my opinion, he is the number one of that offense. I don't care what Kendrick Bourne does with one catch. Jakobi Meyers is the number one of that offense. And if and when they have to throw the ball this week against the New York Jets, they're going to find success because Jakobi Meyers is their go-to. And eventually, he's going to find the end zone. I think this may be the week. They're trying to get him there every single week in order to get this monkey off his back. Eventually, they will. Jakobi Meyers is the number 24. Number 25 is Darnell Mooney, another one of the Chicago Bears wide receivers. Darnell Mooney has had 13-plus fantasy points in 2 out of the last 3 games. He's coming off a week in which he had 5 catches, 45 yards, and a touchdown, and that touchdown was literally wide open. He ran a slant down in the red zone. Nobody was covering him. Automatic touchdown, and even took an extra second for Justin Fields to realize, wait, nobody's covering him, and then he threw the ball. Nonetheless, the whole question is, what is the possibility and or potential of Darnell Mooney against Tampa Bay? It's very similar to what I just mentioned with Allen Robinson. When they have to throw the ball for majority of the game, because they will certainly have to, because they're not going to be able to run the ball, Darnell Mooney, Allen Robinson are both going to be peppered with a lot of targets. And if and when that is the case, garbage time is going to be an option. And of course, potential upside because these wide receivers are going against a secondary that is pretty banged up. Darnell Mooney, not a bad option this week, considering his performances as of late and the fact that other slot receivers like Cooper Kupp, 9 catches, 96 yards, and 2 touchdowns, have done some damage against his defense. Maybe if in fact they move him into the slot a little bit more as they have in the last couple weeks, we could see that potential upside enacted. Moving on to Tim Patrick at number 26. Again, when we're talking about consistency at the wide receiver position, Tim Patrick is exactly that. Like I mentioned, the Cleveland Browns defense were not able to stop a single wide receiver last week. Hopkins for 19 points, AJ Green for 16.4, and Christian Kirk for 16 fantasy points. It's the 5th easiest matchup at the wide receiver position, and Tim Patrick has scored 10 or more fantasy points in 4 out of the last 5 games. In terms of consistency, whether it's via yardage, receptions, and or the occasional touchdown, Tim Patrick's in a fantastic spot against an opposing team that is missing a lot offensively and definitely defensively. He's a guy that's an automatic play in my eyes as a lower-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3, that if in fact, of course, many of us are dealing with wide receiver issues and need to play him. Moving on to Michael Pittman Jr. I think there's a possibility that the hamstring and or quad injury that T.Y. Hilton dealing with could end up making him, play a limited role in the coming weeks. And playing against the San Francisco 49ers, isn't one of the easiest matchups, but of course, it isn't one of the most difficult either. They've given up the 13th most points to opposing wide receivers this season. And when I look at what Michael Pittman Jr. did this last week, only 2 receptions for 35 yards, I think that a lot has to do with the fact that they were up and they were running the ball in that second half. I think if in fact he's going back to being that number 1 outside receiver with Paris Campbell probably having a season-ending injury going into the injured reserve, Zach Pascal pretty much disappearing, it is the Michael Pittman / T.Y. Hilton show in terms of the wide receiver position. And eventually it will go back to him. He will get the targets going back in his direction because Carson Wentz has, of course, found a little bit of a relationship and rapport with him in the first 6 weeks of the season, which will continue to expand as we progress, but not a bad option at all playing against San Francisco this week. We move on to Henry Ruggs as our number 28. Henry Ruggs is very volatile. 1 week he's on, 1 week he's off, but he always will have the ability to take 1 catch for 60 yards and a touchdown. That is just pretty much what his entire gist is. And playing against the Philadelphia Eagles, though they ran a lot of cover 2 last week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, pretty much denying Tom Brady of the deep ball, I think there is going to be a potential in which Henry Ruggs will have a singular play because in terms of total, passing attempts that he has gotten this season, majority of them have been for deep plays down the field. They are always trying to take a couple shots every single game for Henry Ruggs. And in my opinion, there's a very good chance while, Darius Slay is probably on a Bryan Edwards-esque wide receiver or maybe even on Darren Waller, Henry Ruggs is able to run loose and find himself some success this week, potentially in the end zone. We have Marquez Callaway as our number 29. Marquez Callaway is coming off of a week in week 5 prior to his bye week in which, of course, he had 4 receptions, 85 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, and 22.5 fantasy points. This week he takes on the Seattle Seahawks on Monday night. Jameis Winston, without Michael Thomas, is going to continue to look in the direction of Marquez Callaway as they take on the 14th easiest matchup at the wide receiver position. I mean, besides this last week in which, of course, the Pittsburgh Steelers offense wasn't able to find that much success. I mean, Deontay Johnson, 9 catches, 71 yards, 25 rushing yards. I mean, Julio went for 128. Justin Jefferson, 9 catches, 118 and a touchdown. Deebo Samuel, 8 catches, 156 and 2 touchdowns. Robert Woods went for 12 catches and 150 against Seattle's defense. Their secondary is struggling heavily, and I think Marquez Callaway, with opportunity, can absolutely take advantage of it. We move on to Tyler Lockett at number 30. Speaking of potential upside, he will always have it, and that is why he needs to be mentioned, because again, I would rather have Tyler Lockett in my lineup than some of these other wide receivers that truly, I don't know if they're going to score. And though Tyler Lockett only caught the ball twice for 35 yards, it literally only takes one play for him to score. I mean, the last time he played against the New Orleans Saints, he had himself over 100 receiving yards and a touchdown, had himself a huge game. Without Russell Wilson, maybe that's not a possibility, but there's always a chance if they go ahead and fix this offense a little bit with Geno Smith that they're able to at least get him into the end zone on a couple big plays, or at least the yardage is able to suffice in this given week. We move on to Christian Kirk, another one of these volatile wide receivers, but this is the situation that we're going to have to deal with this week. There isn't that much consistency down below when these guys are typically in the conversation of the low end, wide receiver 3, high end wide receiver 4, topic. But going into this week, playing against Houston, he always will have potential upside. This year, he's only had 3 good performances. The other 3 have been terrible. So we got about a 50-50 chance here in which whether or not Christian Kirk is going to have himself a fantastic week. I think in terms of his utilization in the slot position, along with Rondale Moore, and then now the inclusion of Zach Ertz, and then even Chase Edmonds in the slot, it will potentially decrease his overall upside, but there's always a chance, and that's why we have him at number 31. Moving on to our number 32, we have Robby Anderson, and to be honest, Robby Anderson could be a top 24 wide receiver every single week. For the amount of opportunity he has been given, 29 targets in the last 3 weeks, he should be doing far more than 3 receptions for 11 yards and a touchdown. 8.6 fantasy points on 11 total targets is horrible. Robby Anderson and Sam Darnold just aren't able to click, but nonetheless, the New York Giants matchup is fantastic. I've talked about it. Kupp just went for 130 yards and 2 touchdowns, while Robert Woods was able to get a pity touchdown, and hopefully Robby Anderson could do that because Lamb and Amari Cooper the week prior were able to score a touchdown. There is a lot of potential for 2 wide receivers succeeding against this New York Giants secondary. Hopefully Robby Anderson can step up to the plate. Corey Davis is our number 33. I don't really like the idea of playing Corey Davis against New England because in week 2, 5 targets, 2 receptions, no yards. Zach Wilson threw too many interceptions. I'm getting flashbacks of that game, and it's beginning to worry me that maybe if in fact they go ahead and triple cover Corey Davis once again, I mean, it's over. Corey Davis isn't going to be able to do much. But I thought to myself, how couldn't the New England Patriots defense triple cover CeeDee Lamb? I mean, why did they man him up for a majority of that game? And why did they let CeeDee Lamb go for over 30 fantasy points against them? Obviously, the overtime definitely helped him, expand his overall upside. But nonetheless, CeeDee Lamb was able to just dominate against that defense. Is it because, that respective offense has Schultz to worry about, Amari Cooper to worry about, Zeke catching the ball 7 times out of the backfield, Pollard getting a lot of, checkdowns? Maybe that's the case. But nonetheless, I think when there's an offense like the Jets that has struggled running the ball, and it's probably not going to be as difficult stopping them on the ground, they just have to put their focus on stopping Corey Davis and then just manning up everybody else. We move on to our number 34, T. Higgins. T. Higgins has unfortunately been in this single-point fantasy digit performances in the last 2 consecutive weeks and is not, pretty much panned out to what we anticipated him being in the last couple weeks since he's returned from his shoulder injury. If, in fact, he can have a great performance here, I'd be willing to run him in future weeks, but it is a Baltimore Ravens matchup, and I'm not excited about that because, of course, they've got a pretty good secondary. But luckily for T. Higgins, a lot of the teams that expose this secondary typically do it against the Baltimore Ravens' number 2 cornerback, which is the reason why Michael Pittman scored a couple weeks back. And while Jamar Chase is distracted on the other side of the field with Marlon Humphreys, maybe T. Higgins could step up and be a main target. Moving on to Amon-Ra St. Brown. Again, if Jared Goff is going to be taking on his former team, he's got to show some signs of life. And if he's going to potentially do so, maybe it's just throwing the ball to the slot position and just feeding it to Amon-Ra St. Brown, the rookie wide receiver. I mean, just as last week, like we talked about, Tony came out, 3 catches, 37 yards, right off the rip, was fantastic. And then Sterling Shepard just followed it up with, getting himself 10 catches for 76 yards, just slaughtering out of the slot position against the Rams. If we can get a situation in which Amon-Ra St. Brown is just getting consistent targets, then why not? The final option I wanted to mention is because of the fact that I've heard that Baker Mayfield, Nick Chubb, the right tackle and the left tackle, of course, Kareem Hunt, maybe even OBJ and Jarvis Landry are all going to be missing. And if that's the case, and we have Case Keenum at the starting quarterback position, then Donovan Peoples-Jones is going to be the only receiving option there that's available to score fantasy points. I'm not too interested in those tight ends. I think Case Keenum is typically a guy that just funnel targets his number one guy. And at this current moment in time, it would be Donovan Peoples-Jones if, in fact, those other receiving options are out. And I think that's probably going to be the case. Let's not forget, Donovan Peoples-Jones did score 60, 70, of his total 100 receiving yards and one of his touchdowns via end of the first half touchdown. That was a Hail Mary. So take that into account. But otherwise, he's a big, strong receiver, got strong hands. If he has the opportunity, could take advantage of it. Anyway, thank you everybody for watching. These were my rankings for week 7 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Again, I told you it was very difficult to rank this week because there are so many wide receivers missing. A lot of these guys we've never mentioned before in this position. But nonetheless, we mentioned them. Thank you everybody for watching. Make sure you subscribe. Check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew with your first deposit of $10 or more. You'll be given an additional $10 in bonus cash. Outside of that, tomorrow we'll talk about quarterbacks and tight ends in the same video. We'll talk about some Thursday Night Football. And outside of that, thank you guys, and I'll see you next time. Peace.